Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do a new entry here. This one actually from a random entry there on the website I'd like to use that showcases a very long list of mafioso and gangsters from the late 1800s, early 1900s, pretty much up to today. This entry has to do with someone that could truly be considered a lifelong gangster. I mean, this was someone from a very young age that was already doing so many nefarious activities all the way until his old age. The day he died, he was absolutely involved within mafioso gangster activities. In fact, if you could showcase like a textbook example of someone's life involved in the mafia, this was the guy through and through. In fact, you're looking at a picture of him now. Looks can be deceiving, right? He looks like somebody that should pretty much be managing like a library, let alone being involved in so many mafioso type activities. But it goes to show again how looks can be deceiving. But yes, his full name was Joseph Armone. As always, they go by nicknames, and in his case, his nickname was Piney. More on that here as to why he had a very unique name like that. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating information associated with this very lifelong gangster. So who was this Joseph Piney Armone? So he was someone that was born on September 13th, 1917, specifically in the Upper East Side Manhattan area. You could already tell that being born in that location, even if you're not directly involved with the mafia, there's going to be so much activity there indirectly involved that inevitably you're going to be associated with that world. And it goes to show because at the early age, like of his teens, maybe up to his 20s, in this case by the 1930s, he was already doing extortion. In this case, he was extorting money from some Christmas tree vendors. Can you believe that? He was actually that pretty much involved when it comes to extorting things from Christmas tree vendors. In fact, he was so good at it that he actually earned the nickname Piney. That's essentially why he was called Piney. People just inevitably tied him to that type of activity, and ever since then it stuck to him for the rest of his life. But his family was also involved within the world of the mafia. In fact, he had a brother by the name of Stephen Armone, who was someone that became an early member of the Mangano crime family, which in turn was an earlier version of the Gambino crime family. So it was following the brother's footsteps that allowed this guy, Joseph Piney Armone, to officially join the mafia. Along the way, he ended up marrying a woman by the name of Josephine De Quarto, and in turn had 2 children. And what's interesting is that even though he was involved with so much of this type of mafioso activity through and through to the day he died, one thing he didn't do was be involved with mistresses. You know how you hear about so many of these mafia and gangsters just have so many mistresses almost throughout the days of the week. Here in this case, though, Joseph Piney Armone was a devoted family man. He absolutely just enjoyed being with his family, staying faithful to his family, and they ended up living there in Brooklyn. So interesting stuff when it comes to the almost ironic twist there. Now back to the Mangano family that was run by a guy by the name of Albert Mad Hatter Anastasia. He took over the family, and then because this guy Piney ended up being a big earner, he in turn became someone kind of prominent within the family itself. In fact, at one point, the underboss, Joseph Biondo, took a favoring to Joseph Armone, and he in turn wanted to take over the family by killing Albert Anastasia. And when this was about to happen, it turns out though that Piney was arrested on a narcotics charge. More on that here in a minute when it comes to drugs, because it seemed like this was going to be a special trait of his later on. He was arrested on these drug charges and sent to jail, and that in turn kept him from doing the hit on Albert Mad Hatter Anastasia. But the underboss, Joseph Biondo, just ended up using his brother, again, the other guy, Stephen Armone, that I mentioned a minute ago, and they in turn ended up killing Anastasia. And then in an interesting twist, Piney Armone himself actually survived an assassination attempt there in 1964. Somebody went into a Manhattan bar that he was in and then ended up shooting him 5 times at point blank range, but he ended up surviving. Obviously, there's like some kind of angel that was on him at that point, because being shot 5 times in a row like that, it would take a miracle for someone to survive, but he ended up doing so. This did not faze him one bit, though, because shortly afterward, on October 1st, 1964, he was already knee-deep in what was considered one of the largest transportations of drugs and heroin within the United States. This was called the French Connection case, and in it, from 1956 all the way to 1965, he was involved within it. He ended up transporting, him and the people he was working with, almost $20 million worth of heroin. Remember, I was mentioning earlier that this would almost be a niche associated with him when it comes to drugs. Absolutely, because he ended up doing this, but eventually he got caught. And when that happened, he ended up getting sentenced to 15 years in jail. 15 years, it could show too that how light that is, considering how much drugs were being considered here. But he in turn got sentenced for that shorter time period. And then it turns out too, another interesting twist in his life, one of the jurors there ended up being approached by a Playboy bunny, a former Playboy bunny by the name of Patricia D'Alessandro. She was actually a big friend of Piney. She was a friend of his for who knows how long. And when that happened, she tried to bribe the juror. Who knows what was happening when it comes to that bribery, but it was enough for the juror to report that incident to the authorities, and then that woman actually ended up being convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. So even though he in turn was sentenced to prison, this woman apparently was a big fan of his, big friend, and then ended up being in prison because of her very actions. But after 10 years, only 10 years from those 15 years in prison, he ended up being released, and then by that point, Paul Castellano ended up being the family boss of the Gambino family, and he in turn made Piney a capo regime. As it turns out, though, there was a big underlying hate associated with or towards Paul Castellano. Everybody knows the famous circumstance involving John Gotti and what he did in order to usurp that power and take over things. Well, this guy, Piney Armone, was someone that was also having a resentment towards Paul Castellano. Part of it could be alluded to the fact that Paul Castellano seemed to have something involving like aversion to drugs. And here this guy was, Piney, involving himself, being known for so many of these drugs, and then John Gotti and others apparently having no issues with doing that kind of stuff. So as it turns out, later on, whenever he became a more prominent member within the Gambino family, there he was, Piney, once again being involved with extortion, bribery, interstate illegal travels when it comes to drugs and bribery. In fact, at a certain point, he was actually found guilty. He was convicted there in New York of all these charges, not including, in fact, of course, all those other drug charges that he was doing. So the big one, though, that ended up catching him was this. As it turns out, he was involved with a bribery of yet another government official. It sounded like this one, though, was actually more directly tied to him. He was in turn trying to have $20,000 given to someone prominent to transfer a mafioso's son from a New York State prison to a federal prison. I guess to try to move it from a more hardcore prison to a more quote-unquote luxurious prison, at least luxurious for the world of mafioso gangsters, the ones we see like in the movie Goodfellas that showcases like all the nice things that they were able to get and do in prison, but I guess it's just a prison depended on the prison that they went to. Well, he was caught trying to do that, and when that happened, the judge finally had enough. They were going to sentence him. Remember, he was going in and out of jail at this point several times, and so in this case, the judge was going to sentence him a final sentence in the sense that by this time, by this age, whatever sentence that was going to be in this, like probably more than 10 years, would have been considered a lifelong sentence. And so Armone tried and see, if he could just get something done when it comes to a temporary release, something associated with a final goodbye, maybe something like in terms of a final Christmas with his family. But no, John Gotti said, no, there will be no acknowledgement of the Mafia family because that was one of the conditions in order to be let out to essentially be on a quick bail to go say goodbye to a family, is to admit their role within the Mafia. And then that was, of course, forbidden when it came to the world of John Gotti. So as it occurred, he was finally sentenced to 15 years in prison, fined a huge amount $820,000. And then and when that happened, he was pretty much there for the next 4 years when he ended up dying in prison of natural causes. In fact, by the time he died, he was around 74 years old. And again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, pretty much through and through, lifelong gangster, doing all these gangster activities till the day he died. He didn't rat on anyone. He didn't do anything to lessen prison sentences, even though he was trying to, but he didn't go beyond borders, like trying to circumvent things. No, he stayed pretty much as a mafia gangster to the end, and he ended up dying there in prison. And even now, he's buried there in a cemetery called the Cemetery of the Resurrection, there in Staten Island, New York. But that's pretty much it. That's all the information associated with Piney Armone, Joseph Piney Armone. If anybody has any more info, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. How about that? I was mentioning that earlier. There he was involved with so many notable people throughout the world of the mafia, starting off from being an early member of the Mangano crime family, which would in turn be the Gambino crime family, then being involved with Albert, Mad Hatter, and Anastasia, at least in an indirect fashion, then being involved with the French Connection, one of the longest running heroin transportation operations within the U.S., and then finally being involved with Paul Castellano and John Gotti himself. And he was also seen as someone that was more of a, because of his lifelong association, someone that was almost admired within the world of the mafia. But again, ended up dying in prison from all of this. But again, anyone has any more information, please post those comments below. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.